Well, welcome back, and delight to have back with us, very timely as well, to have back with us today Scott Feltman. He is the Executive Vice President of One Israel Fund, and he's a Newsmax blogger. You can go to oneisraelfund.org is their website, and check it out, oneisraelfund.org. Scott, good to see you again. Thanks for being with us, and give us an update. I understand Secretary Mike Pompeo was in Israel. How'd that go?
Oh, and amazing. The first time somebody from the American government, especially the State Department, visited the Golan Heights, visited one of the communities in Judea and Samaria, and basically put somewhat of a cap on the past 4 years of the Trump administration's policies towards Israel. It was an amazing day.
So, what you're thinking about the possibility of President Trump not being there?
Look, we have a tremendous gratitude to everything that's taken place over the past 4 years. There's no question about it, from recognizing the Golan Heights to moving the embassy to Jerusalem, to all of the policies that he has pushed forward, which we believe has not only strengthened Israel, but strengthened the entire Middle East, to the Abraham Accords, obviously, and all of these countries that are now coming to create relations with Israel. I'm very, very thankful for the past 4 years. That being said, we have to see what's going to be. If we go backwards to the policies that have been in place over the past, I do think it's a step backwards for peace, not only in Israel, but also in the whole Middle East. But if they build upon some of the successes that the Trump administration has put in place, I think that, the future is strong. I do believe, though, that Israel itself is strong. Whatever happens going forward, I believe that Israel is in a much better place today than it was previously, and its regional alliances will only make it that much more successful going forward.
Well, that's great. I was going to go down that road, but let me ask you this. How vulnerable or safe are Israelis living in Judea and Samaria?
So it's interesting. Obviously, you know that we do a lot of work with security, and while the past 4 years, there hasn't, thank God, been any major terrorist attacks, we do see that there is always a steady ebb and flow with attempts, and we do a lot of work with putting in preventive security equipment to detect it. So we see this all the time. My biggest fear is that whenever the enemies of Israel, and I don't mean to paint it with a wide brush, but there are quite a number of terrorist cells throughout the area. Whenever they feel like they are empowered or emboldened, then they up their game. So we are seeing a little bit more activity right now, and hopefully we'll be able to quell that, and we'll be able to move forward. The communities of Judea and Samaria are over almost 500,000 Israeli citizens today. It's not what it was back in the early days of Oslo, when there were 100,000 Jews all throughout the area. It's strong, and it's beautiful communities. It's not like tent cities. I mean, these are beautiful, growing, thriving communities. They have their issues. We need to take care of those issues, which is what we do. But they're stronger today than they were previously, and they'll be stronger tomorrow than they are today.
The recent peace accords, Scott, were extraordinary. I mean, they were just amazing. And there was even thought and talk that there would be more coming. Do you sense that could happen before an administration change?
So there are certainly discussions taking place, and I don't put anything past President Trump. He always seems to have something up his sleeve. There are a number of countries that are in discussions right now. I believe, even in the next administration, that because the dynamic of Iran and what it places in the region, the more powerful Iran thinks they are, I believe that the more nations in the region are going to come to Israel to form alliances. So I don't see that momentum slowing down. I do believe that we have a tremendous wind at our back right now, and an opportunity in front of us, certainly over the next number of weeks. But if we go back to the policies of getting back into a nuclear agreement along the same lines as it was previously, I could see a number of countries coming to Israel for strategic purposes.
Yeah.
I also, sorry.
No, excuse me. I think that part of that is we don't get it here in the West is the Shiite-Sunni thing, and so that's a big player in all of this. So we'll see how that goes. Let me ask you this, Scott. Back up to Lebanon. They had an incredible event up there with the explosion, and it's left that country somewhat vulnerable. Israel offered to go in there and help, and they turned it down. How vulnerable is Lebanon right now?
So we have to understand Lebanon from the perspective of when you say Lebanon, who are we talking about? So Hezbollah, which has been the de facto entity running Lebanon, has taken a major hit through that. And I find it very interesting that shortly thereafter, the Lebanese government, I don't know if it was officially reached out to Israel or if it was a mutual situation, but there's this whole gas reserves that are in the waters off the coast of Israel. And it's been disputed between Lebanon and Israel for quite a while. And all of a sudden now, Israel and Lebanon are having mutual discussions on how to move forward with developing that area. So you see things changing even in our greatest enemies over the past number of years. So I don't think it's coincidental that Hezbollah may have been somewhat mitigated a little bit because of the explosion and how the society rose up against what has been going on with these stockpiles of dangerous materials that took many civilian lives. And now the government is developing at least lines of communication which have not been there before with Israel. And you said, the Shiite-Sunni dynamic, it's somewhat worse than the Arab-Israel conflict. They hate each other going back, over a thousand years. And you see the dynamics of how people, the region is aligning themselves with Iran and Saudi Arabia. And now the nations that are friendly with Saudi Arabia are making alliances with Israel. And one other point that you brought up that we don't understand from a Western perspective of what goes on in the Middle East, strength really does play a major role in who controls the cards. It's not a democratic society. They don't function on Western values. So whereas the Arab nations may have hated Israel for many years, they also see Iran as the greatest threat. And they also see Israel as one of the only entities in that region that could stand up to Iran. So it's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah.
And there's a situation where they realize that Israel has more value to them than not. So we're willing to make somewhat of regional alliance. And that's what's going on right now.
I just think that if there is an administration's change in the United States, what has been set in place there through the Trump administration policies and these recent peace agreements really puts you in a strong position and would weaken an attempt to reestablish the Iran nuclear deal. That's what it appears to me. Am I right or wrong?
I think you're correct. And the interesting thing is the Arab nations, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the UAE, are already involved in lobbying the incoming or the
potential.
I'm not sure of the right word,
potential incoming.
Potential Biden administration as to being very careful about getting back into an agreement with Iran. It's not even coming from Israel alone. The Arab nations, and there are quite a number of them that are traditional allies of America, are in a situation where they are fearful of America getting back into such an agreement. The sanctions have been working in many ways against Iran over the past number of years, and it's basically minimized Iran's reach in the region. And to go back to that, the Arab nations have just as much, if not more, to lose than Israel does.
Yeah. I was going to ask you that. Is Iran, from your perspective, weakened and vulnerable these days?
They're certainly in a weaker position than they were. That's no question. The American sanctions have hurt their economy. The problem is, the mullahs in Iran don't care so much for their own people. So, and as much as we try to make sure that the humanitarian part of our involvement with Iran is not so affected, Unfortunately, it's a byproduct of the sanctions. So it is hurting the entire society, but it's very possible that will be the deciding factor in what happens with those who are running the country. But they are certainly minimized. They have no access to the American banking system, and the money that they were paid out, which is a terrible situation that they were given so much money that they basically used for terrorist activities, has for the most part dried up. Hamas has looked to other entities to help fund them, as have other terrorist groups that they were funding, including Hezbollah.
How is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu surviving all his challenges these days with all this going on?
He's an interesting person. Look, on the world stage, he is the most masterful politician that there is. So while he has his suspect legal situation at home, and I'm not going to really get into that so much, he plows forward. He was still elected, even with everything going on, with a majority. And even though the way the dynamics of the parliamentary system in Israel doesn't elect one prime minister, and you have to have a bunch of parties coming together, he's still the leading statesman, and there's really nobody on the stage that's prepared to replace him. And as a world leader and somebody who was educated in the United States and speaks a perfect English, Israel has not had a better statesman in its existence, and that's why he's the longest-serving prime minister in the history of the country.
One last question, Scott, and thank you for your time today. Tell us about One Israel Fund. What is it you guys do?
So we were founded right after the signing of the Oslo Accords. Our founder, Dr. Yechiel Leiter, realized at the time that the communities that existed throughout Judea and Samaria, and at the time in Gaza and the Jordan Valley, were integral to the future of the state of Israel from a strategic standpoint, from a historic standpoint. It's called the biblical heartland for a reason, and we were created to make sure that they had the humanitarian needs in order to stay safe and to thrive. We're apolitical in the sense that whatever the Israeli government does, that's for the people of Israel to decide. But as long as there are people living in these communities and their lives are in danger on a daily basis, and also need certain things so that children have playgrounds and schools and libraries and so on and so forth. That's what One Israel Fund is for. And it's very ironic that Secretary Pompeo visited the Psagot winery yesterday, which just recently relocated to Shar Binyamin, which is the industrial park in the Benjamin region, which is just north of Jerusalem. Right down the block, we are building a regional medical center, a hospital, in essence, for that entire area, which will serve as both Jew and non-Jew. And those are the type of things that we are involved with. We want to protect the people who are living there and make sure that their lives are fruitful and better. And whenever we can, we try to make sure it benefits the entire area.
You guys do wonderful work. Let me say to our viewers and listeners, check out Scott's website, oneisraelfund.org. You can learn a lot there, and you can support them, oneisraelfund.org. Go there and support them. Thank you, Scott. Let's stay connected. Thanks for your work. Fascinating times, isn't it?
Perry, thank you so much. It's always fascinating times. It's amazing. This tiny country is always on everybody's front page.
God bless you, friend. Okay.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving.
You too.